Hi, my name is Laura Fliss. I'm an autism consultant working for Livonia Public Schools, and I also provide outreach autism consulting services to all of Western Wayne County at the elementary level through Wayne RESA. I also happen to be a START presenter, that is Statewide Autism and Resources and Training Initiative, which is a grant provided by the Michigan Department of Public Education that funds a program out of Grand Valley State University that is a group of people that put together resources and training based on evidence-based practices and best practices for people with autism spectrum disorders and educating them. And that is supported by the Michigan Department of Education. So I've been sanctioned to provide these trainings through START and also through my work as an autism county consultant. So this is going to be a 4-part series because they tend to be pretty long, so bear with me. The first part that we're going to talk about today, part 1, is PBIS for students with autism spectrum disorder, thinking about functional behavior assessment, FBA. This is where your mindset needs to be when you're thinking about behavior in students with autism, behavior in all students actually. Our guiding principles are these, that we don't start anything with opinions. When we are thinking about correcting problem behavior, we don't do that starting with things like, it seems like, we think it only happens when, I really feel like. It doesn't start with opinion statements. All of the decisions that we make when planning for students with autism spectrum disorder and their behaviors are based on the law in IDEA and also No Child Left Behind. These things are provided for. We're going to get into that just a little bit. The research, what does the research say works to fix the problems of behavior with students with ASD? And what does the data say that supports whether what we're trying is working or not working? We're going to talk about evidence-based practices, EBPs. So what's an evidence-based practice? An evidence-based practice is something that a strategy or technique that we use that's supported by well-designed, replicable, reputable research. It says that we've tested this theory out and we have lots and lots of research that supports that this actually works. We have data that supports that. And if you want to know what are specific techniques that work for students with ASD, here are 24 of them. There are more. As time goes on and research changes, this grows, and I'm going to show you some sites that you can get this information from. But if you look, there are different techniques that work for different issues: academics and cognition, behavior, communication, play, social, and transition. All of these are things that people with ASD have problems with. And there are different techniques that work with different students at different age levels. So EC means early childhood, EL means elementary, and MH means middle school and high school. And on this list, where you see something in green, that means that this particular type of intervention works well for children at this age level. So for example, antecedent-based interventions, and we're going to talk about that a little bit, I think in section 2 or 3 of this, works for children at all age levels for academics and cognition. It also works for all age levels for behavior. But there's no research really to support that works in the areas of communication, play, or social skills training. For those areas, you might look at some of these interventions in this area here. So that's how this technique works. And let me get to a couple of other slides just to show you where you can find more information about this. Some of the sites that I use on a regular basis are the NAPDC, National Professional Developmental Center on Autism Spectrum Disorders, and OCALI and the Autism Internet modules. These are all kind of linked together in the same sites, but let me show you how you go there. The NPDC is a site that looks like this, and it has a number of areas that you can go to find out, what is evidence-based practice, what are the standards that they use to determine whether this is acceptable research, and the evidence-based practice briefs themselves. Now, the evidence-based practice briefs themselves, actually will give you step-by-step instructions for how to perform all of these different strategies. And going with the antecedent-based interventions idea, I'll click on that for you just to show you. It gives you an overview of what an antecedent-based intervention is, What's the research that actually supports that this is an effective strategy? What ages does it work with? What skills does it address? And what settings does it work in? So some of these might be things that are done at home, some of them might be done in a clinical setting, and some of them are done in the classroom. I believe that ABI is something that's effective in all settings depending on how you want to use it. If you scroll down further, it gives you the overview, it gives you the actual articles that the research is based on. I'll show you that quickly. This is the research that supports evidence-based practices, and you could go through and actually read that research if you're a studious kind of person. But if you're like most people, you just want to know how to do it. So you click on the steps for implementation, and look what happens. You open it up and it gives you a lesson plan, essentially, for how to utilize this strategy. And you will find these types of techniques, or these types of steps. It also gives you data sheets and data collection systems for all of these different strategies to know how to work with students with autism. So that's one of the websites that I use. The other, if you're not a reader, you're not somebody who enjoys learning from reading, this is a really cool option. It does the same thing. It's free, but you do have to register and log in. Which I will do so that I can show you. This too gives you a list of different strategies, and this one is organized in a different way. Here's if you wanted to know about things that work with infants and toddlers, things that work at home, things that work in the classroom, it will give you a list of things that work in these various areas. If you're like me though, you want to cut to the chase and just look for things in a list, I always click on Browse Alphabetically, and again, this should look a little bit familiar. It gives you a bigger list of evidence-based strategies because it's much more specific, and it shows you how to utilize all of these things. Something that I use a lot with people is the incredible 5-point scale. So you hear me, if you ever call me in to consult, a lot of times I'll tell you, well, did you try an incredible 5-point scale? And this goes into sort of a college level course on how to do an incredible 5-point scale. It gives you a pre-test looking at what are your current knowledge, what are the objectives of this little mini course, what are the CEC professional standards of this course, because you can actually earn credits for taking these courses. Then it goes into the overview of what is a 5-point scale, designing a 5-point scale, how do you teach kids to use a 5-point scale. What's cool is that it actually has video and instruction. This is like a mini college course, as I said. Another interesting thing about this site is that it has a pre-test and a post-test. So sometimes I actually will use this as a professional development tool with staff or paraprofessionals. You get your credits, you take the pre-test and the post-test, you turn that in at the end, and that actually can count as professional development. So that's a really great scale to learn how to use some of the evidence-based practices for students with autism spectrum disorders as well. And I highly recommend either of these two sites as excellent resources as you are looking for strategies to deal with challenging behaviors and academic and social and communication skills with kids with ASD as well. Several other really cool resources that I use when I'm consulting with people about autism spectrum disorder is the National Autism Standards Project. It gives you just some really good information about that research that took place when a group of researchers in the United States got together to deal with this phenomenon, and it's all tied together with the evidence-based practices that I showed you before. It gives you more information on that. The USAP, the Universal Supports Assessment and Planning Tool, this is something that's basically a cookbook for, a cookbook strategy for how to create your classroom for students with ASD. I'm trying to find the actual handout. Let's see if I can. I'm going to actually put this into your presentation. USAP with scoring guide. I'm going to actually put this in a folder so you can access it. If you're creating a program for students with autism or looking at your classroom and whether it's effective for students with autism, this is an assessment tool that you would give yourself to see how you're doing. And there are several categories of quality indicators, okay? First, it talks about your guiding principles and how you're building, what your building philosophy is, and how effective is that for students with ASD. Then it talks about your team process. How well do you work together to collaborate as a team to function for students with ASD? How well do you work with parents, and what kind of family support do you provide for families of students with ASD? What are your educational strategies? How are you supporting the student in the classroom academically? How are you setting things up and structuring things there? There's quite a bit about that. Visual organizations and supports. How are we doing on that? Does the child have a functional communication system? Does the child need additional adult support, and how effective is the adult support that's being provided? How are you utilizing peers? How is your peer-to-peer support program? Those are all things that we consider to be non-negotiable techniques and non-negotiable parts of an effective program for students with ASD. And this, again, is an assessment tool that can help you understand what you can do better in to support your student with ASD. And again, I'll include that. In fact, I'll save it now so I remember to give it to you. That will be in the folder with this lecture series. Georgia State University also has an enhancing instructional context for students with classroom with ASD. It's going to be a very similar kind of a tool, so I won't click on that, but you can go to that link if you like. The Mind Institute has more information that you can check out for that. The Texas Statewide Leadership for Autism Training is another very similar tool that you can also take a look at. But this is another one that I consider a go-to. It's in my favorites bar on all of the computers that I have access to. The Association for Science in Autism Treatment, or ASAT Online. This one is awesome because in my line of work, I hear all sorts of crazy things that parents and teachers are doing to intervene with students with autism, typically parents, because, it is 1 in 66 as of the latest CDC information. People have autism, and nobody has come up with any real medical cures or medical interventions. So parents tend to get pretty desperate, and they're looking into a lot of different techniques and treatments, and there are a lot of disreputable sources out there that are preaching things to parents that there's really no research to support. Now, I used to say to parents, you know what, if it's not invasive and it doesn't break the bank, go ahead and try it. Things like, I've heard everything from laying hands on at church to horseback riding to, riding with the dolphins to the hyperbaric chamber, which is an oxygen tank, that kind of a thing that they put in, to injecting pig hormones into students, chelation, which is a removing of the toxic metals. There are all sorts of things, supplements, casein gluten-free diet. There are all sorts of things like that parents are trying. And this site here will tell you, what does the research actually say? This is a site that you can trust, that is a non-judgmental, unilateral site that just looks at the research and what does it say about these various treatments. For example, if we were looking at, if we wanted to know what medications might be effective, let's see, a parent tells us they've got their child on Ritalin. No idea if I spelled that correctly. Let's find out. Let's say, what does the research have to say about the use of Ritalin? Biomedical interventions, medications, Ritalin. Well, here's a site that talks about that. And it kind of gives you the information. And I highly recommend this for teachers and parents, and for teachers to share with parents. So if our first guiding principle was that we want to do things based on data-based decision making and what does the research say and how to do that, our second guiding principle is the idea that educating students with autism, the primary goals for that are socialization, communication, and independence. And those are the two keys that we really need to address for students with autism spectrum disorders, even in the educational setting. That offends a lot of people, those of us who are teachers, because we're and thanks to No Child Left Behind and all of the standards that we are required to adhere to and everything that we're made accountable for, we also need to see these kids make progress on academics. So we say, what about academics? You're spending all this time addressing his social problems and his communication problems and his working independence. What about academics? Well, here's the thing about academics. Kids with ASD, in my vast experience, whenever I get called out to a gen ed classroom or even a center-based classroom, it's not because the kid is struggling academically. Literally, no one ever asks me, how do I teach this kid? How does he learn? A lot of my students, have pretty good academic talents in terms of if you tested them on a Woodcock-Johnson or something, their skills would look really high. Some of them are in fact gifted, and many of them are average in terms of their abilities to do academics. That's generally not the problem in the room. The problem in terms of them accessing the academics typically is because they're inattentive, they're off task, they don't have inherent motivation to perform for you, to do the work, to complete the work. They don't have the social skills to attend or not be obnoxious in class. They might have acting out behaviors. Typically, it's these two reasons why my kids' behavior and social communication are the two primary reasons why my students with ASD are excluded from the gen ed environment. It's because they're obnoxious, because they can't attend, because they require direct instruction to focus on the task at hand. But the problem is that if you're not exposed to what's being taught in the general education classroom, you don't have the opportunity to learn it. It's not like you can just go out into the ASD classroom and get ready to learn it. If you're not immersed in the curriculum that's being presented, you don't have the opportunity to learn that curriculum. So this is not a readiness model. Now, getting into PBIS, or positive behavior intervention systems, which is something that most schools have a version of happening nowadays, there are certain things that are controllables. Oftentimes when I'm called into a meeting, it's to talk about the uncontrollables. What are the things that we can't control? Well, if the mom would just put him on meds, if the mom would stop tweaking the meds, if the mom would just make sure he did his homework at home, if the mom would just keep him ready, if he would only attend in class, if he, if, and we spend hours and hours and hours talking about things that we don't have any control over, and therefore the plan never moves forward. The child never improves because we're not addressing those things that are controllable, that are things that we can do something about. So here is the list of things, this in the next couple of slides, of things that we can do something about and where we should be focusing our energies. The first thing that we need to be focusing on is preventing the challenging behaviors from happening before they happen. Identify when they might happen and figure out how to keep that from happening in the beginning. So that's proactive, creating supportive environments. The next step is figuring out what new skills need to be taught and teaching those. That's educational. So creating environmental changes, teaching new skills, and finally teaming, working together collaboratively, a problem-solving approach, using a variety of perspectives. You need input from the student, from the parents, from the paraprofessional if she's a part of the team, from the administrator, from the classroom teacher, from the special education teacher, from the speech pathologist, from the social worker. There are a number of people working on this student, and it takes all of their perspectives. The collaborative approach is something that looks at the big picture. It's something that takes all of this information into account to create an effective plan. What do you need to know about the student? What do you need to know about his behaviors, about his preferences, about his likes, about his dislikes, about what might be happening with him to be causing the problem behavior, or what might motivate him? What do you know about the setting? What type of classroom teacher is involved here? What are her rules and expectations? Not every classroom teacher is created equally. What's acceptable in one classroom will be totally unacceptable in another classroom. How is this teacher structuring her classroom? What is she able and willing to do in her environment? What do we know about the environment that he's in? It might be working for the gen ed teacher, but not when he goes to specials. What do we know about those settings and what needs to be adapted there? That's all information that we need to bring in. Knowledge about autism spectrum disorder specifically, and what are some EBPs or evidence-based practices or effective supports for students with ASD. And what about the basic principles of behavior? I mean, that's not something that we learn a lot of in college, is behavior management. And we talk about PBS and PBIS, but how much training do teachers really get, and how deeply do they really understand how to impact challenging behavior in students who have not so typical neurology? So the thing is that not one person, there is no one person who has all of this information. In order to get information about the student, you have to ask all the players, including the student and the parents and all of the educators involved. If you want to talk about the setting, you can have your autism consultant come in and design a behavior plan, but if she doesn't do that based on what works for that classroom teacher in that environment, the plan's going to fail, and so on and so forth. So you need to put all of these pieces into place. You have to create a proactive environment for the student with ASD. You have to have that piece where you're teaching him replacement behaviors and new skills. You have to be teaming on a regular basis, coming back to the table, looking at a variety of perspectives. And guess what? If you've built what you think is the perfect plan, because you've done proactive stuff, you've built in the teaching new skills piece, you've got your team working and playing together well, you still are going to have to come back to the table on a regular basis. I recommend with students that are actively having problems, coming back and reviewing your data and looking at charts and graphs on a weekly basis. Even students who are doing well and moving along nicely should be coming back and looking at the data at least weekly, but potentially even meeting again, making new decisions monthly. You come back to the table after the behavior plan has been devised. You go out into the world with the student and you take data on the behavior plan that you devised. Then you come back to the team, review the data, look at graphs. Did it get better? Did it get worse? Did it get the same? And do we need to make changes based on the data that we've collected? That's non-negotiable, folks. Now here's a paradigm shift for you. With PBIS, absence of the behavior isn't the goal. Does that shock you? Absence of the behavior isn't the goal. So it's not like you're trying to get the kid to stop having meltdowns. It's not like you're trying to get the kid to stop shouting out in class. It's not like you're trying to get the kid to stop falling asleep in class. That's not the goal. The goal is, what's the positive behavior that you're trying to get to? It's not the absence of the negative behavior, it's the presence of the positive behavior. So in another format, I told you this in a couple of slides back, there are 3 things that you have control over as an educational team. First is preventing the problem behavior. Next is teaching a new behavior or replacement behavior to replace that problem behavior. And finally, the thing that you have control over is how the adults and sometimes how the other students in the classroom react to that behavior. So looking at preventative behavior and what can we do to prevent the challenging behavior from occurring in the first place. Again, go back and look at your sites that I talked about. These are some of the evidence-based strategies that you can use to prevent that behavior. You can use antecedent-based interventions. So those are interventions we're going to get to in a little bit that look at what was the antecedent or the cause of the behavior, and you try to control that antecedent and keep it from happening. Visual schedules and supports, letting the kid know when he gets to do what he wants to do, because a lot of times with my kids with autism, it's all about I want to do what I want to do, and it's really letting him know this is my time, here's when you get to have your time. Functional communication systems. Does he have the ability to let you know that he needs a break, or that he needs to request something, or that he needs to tell you, no, I don't want to do that? Does he have the ability to communicate those things to you? Do you have peer-mediated interventions in place? A lot of times the behavior problems that I see with students with autism are because they are just so socially inept and they don't know that they're being inappropriate with peers. They don't know that they are rude. They don't know that they are setting other kids off. They don't read the cues that the other kids dislike them, and then they get angry, and then they have acting out behaviors towards students. There's a lot that you can do to train the peers on the front end how to interact with this student when he acts inappropriately. If he does this, students, you can do this, and that's how you can be a good friend. You can train those kids and they can become your greatest ally. So having that in place can be something that's preventative. You know he's going to have a problem on the playground, so let's build him a circle of friends that knows how to interact with him and that can be supportive of him when he's having struggles. The second piece is teaching new skills and teaching replacement behaviors. Teaching systems and replacement behaviors using effective teaching techniques. So you're going to reinforce the appropriate behaviors and use differential reinforcement so that gets kind of carried on throughout the day. You're going to every so often reinforce, hey, I like the way you did this. Just now you raised your hand instead of shouting out. I love it when you do that. Then another way to train new skills, and we're going to get into this in one of the later sections, is prompting. The problem with prompting that I see is that most of the time it's done ineffectively, and we never get past the adult prompt phase where the adult is really doing too much for the student, and we really need to focus on learning how to prompt correctly and how to fade that prompt. We're going to get into that. Discrete trial training, especially at the younger ages, and sometimes at the more severe levels, it is individualized. You're breaking things down into tiny little steps and teaching it skill for skill. That's a way that you can teach a new skill. Other examples of ways that you can teach are using the 5-point scale, using social stories, using video modeling to teach how do I behave in certain settings. The third thing that we have control over is how the adults respond, okay? The adults respond in ways that, the adults need to respond in ways that don't reinforce challenging behavior. A huge thing that I see all the time is my students with autism engaging in a power struggle. They love to argue with you, they love to debate with you, and you guys buy into it all the time. We all do. They're masters at it, and it's really challenging not to get into that back and forth. And when we do that, we actually are reinforcing that challenging behavior. We need to be able to do planned ignoring for that. And then we can also, as adults, prevent further escalation. One of the things I see an awful lot of is adults, teachers talking like teachers. Where are you supposed to be right now, Jimmy? What are the other students? Jimmy, what are the other students doing? Where are you supposed to be? Oh, really? You want to argue with me now? Is that really a good choice? And we're using this sort of challenging tone with students to kind of let them know their place. And with kids with Asperger's syndrome and high-functioning autism, this tends to escalate them to a much higher level and oftentimes into crisis behavior, where we could be preventing further escalation using some of these evidence-based practices that we'll kind of get into too. You know, extinction, which is often done by planned ignoring, prompting him to use the appropriate strategies, self-management systems such as the Incredible 5-point scale or something like it, and that's where you're cueing the student to think about how he's acting right now. Where are you right now? Are you on a level 3 of the scale? What should you do to get yourself back down to a 4? And kind of coaching him to use that himself. And a really cool, important one is adult scripts. If all of the adults in the environment have a script that sometimes you can use the Incredible 5-point scale or something like it to develop a script. If the child says or does this, the adult should say or do this. If you have a plan in the first place, because it won't flow naturally, and you have this sort of plan, this is what I say when he says this, it tends to work well with students with autism. So I've been working with kids with autism since 1991, and actually, technically before that, I did some interning in high school. And the ideas of how to interact with people with autism and how to help shape behavior have changed so dramatically in the 20, 30 years I've been doing this, that it really helps me to think about things as old school and new school. Because some of you out there may have learned the old school way like I did. We used to think of the student as being the problem. And when we think of the student as being the problem, we say things like, you know, he doesn't belong here. This isn't his environment. Wouldn't he learn better in a place that could do blah? You know, I just feel like he could perform so much better if he were at this place, in this time, on this medication. If he. That's the way we used to think about things. And we would attempt to fix this student by either changing his placement or, you know, punishing him or getting him on some kind of a medication because he clearly is the problem. Now, what we understand with positive behavior interventions and supports is that it's the system or the setting that needs to change. It's the lack of skills that need to change. Those are the problems. These again are uncontrollables. And we spend all of our time in the areas that we can't control things. There's no solution to this. You can't control whether the child gets on medication. You have very little control over whether the child changes his placement. And realistically, because I go to all settings, I go everywhere from a cross-categorical classroom to a resource room classroom to a classroom for students with autism to a school for students with autism. I've even been to hospitalized settings. And guess what? They're all saying the same thing. They're all saying, if only he were here. It can't be me. The child just needs to be in a different place. Even when he gets to Berger, which is the school for students with autism in this area, they're saying, well, if only he did this. When what we all need to be focusing on is what if we did this? What if we did something to the system, to the setting, to teaching him new skills? Would that then change his behaviors? If we adjust the settings and the systems and improve his skills, we actually make change to the student where he is, and that's where we need to be focusing. Old school problem solving, when we used to do behavior plans, we were looking at reducing the problem behavior. He kicked 27 times today. Our goal by the end of the month is he only kicks 3 times. Now we're not looking at reducing the amount of times he's kicking. We're trying to find out why the heck is he kicking in the first place. What's he trying to tell us? Is he trying to escape? Does he not want to do the work? Well, then let's teach him a replacement behavior, such as to ask for a break or to tell us no. And then to teach him, you know, first do this, and then when in the schedule does he get to do what he wants to do. We're looking at increasing those behaviors of learning how to use the schedule, understanding when it's going to be time for him to have a break or have his own reinforcement times, as opposed to reducing the kicking. Reducing the kicking doesn't really help us, doesn't teach us anything. If we don't look at why is the kicking happening in the first place and what can we do to avoid it. We used to rely heavily on negative consequences. Timeout's always been a big thing in the school, still is. What I find when you put kids with autism in timeout is that you get crisis behavior. Same goes, by the way, for card flipping. Please try to avoid having a kid with Asperger's syndrome flip a card. You'll see that child escalate to crisis behavior immediately. Anytime you try to punish behavior in kids with Asperger's syndrome and high-functioning autism, it has a tendency to escalate the behavior and actually create crisis. What you should be focusing on is positive approaches, trying preventative strategies, trying to reinforce when he's being good. Are there times that we have to use negative consequences? Yes, but just don't expect them to fix the problem. Sometimes, we have kids who are aggressive, or they hit a teacher, or they hit somebody in class, and we have a zero tolerance policy, and we just have certain expectations. That child's going to be suspended. But understand, when he comes back from suspension, he's not going to be in good shape. He's going to be in worse shape. You actually have to do an intervention about the suspension. Old school, we used to really expect a quick fix, and what would happen, and what probably happens with a lot of you, is you've got this challenging student, and you think to yourself, I'm going to call the behavior consultant, and the behavior consultant's going to come riding in on her white horse, and she's going to fix everything. And then when she goes away and gives you some tips, and you realize that you actually just have a lot more work to do, or she maybe hands you this plan and walks away, and you realize that didn't work. That wasn't the quick fix. Same goes for medications. Same goes for change in placement. There is no quick fix. It doesn't exist. Believe me, I've tried them all. The goal nowadays is we're looking for sustained results, and with sustained results, it takes a lot more work. It takes a lot more work on the front end. And what I always say to teams, and by the way, not what I always say to teachers, what I always say to teams that are working with kids with autism is, frankly, you're spending the time now in reactive mode. You're spending the same amount of time dealing with manifestation determinations on kids that are getting suspended all the time, problem solving problem behaviors, ODR, sending them to the principal's office, talking about this problem. I guarantee you're spending at least as much time as you would need to spend on the front end. The difference being, if you spent time on the front end developing an effective plan, putting those strategies in place that we know can teach the child new skills over time, you actually will start collecting data that will show you an improvement in the student's ability to function in a classroom. So I promised you this section was entitled FBA, or the function of behavior, functional behavior assessment. What is the function of the behavior? The only way we can prevent a behavior from happening is to figure out why the heck it's happening, in what environments does it happening, so that we can shape the environment or teach new skills to prevent that from happening. Or what might be reinforcing that behavior, what's making it continue. So we look at things in an A, B, C format. Antecedent behavior and consequence is what ABC stands for when we're talking about determining the function or why the behavior is happening. The antecedent is what happens before, and we look at that to try and prevent that from happening in the first place. So if it always happens during language arts, what is it about language arts? Is there something we can do to language arts to make it simpler for him? Is it happening every time this teacher interacts with him? What is this teacher doing, saying, smelling like, or feeling, and why is that happening? What is happening in that beforehand that's causing the behavior? What exactly is the behavior? What's happening as the behavior is happening? Did you just ask him to do something and now he's acting out? And why do we think he's doing it? Can we teach him new skills? And what is happening after? What might happen after a behavior that might cause the behavior to continue to happen? For example, the student engages in a power struggle and the adult gets into it with him, and he goes back and forth in a power struggle for 20 minutes, and now he hasn't had to complete the work because he's successfully avoided that by engaging in a power struggle. Wow, that power struggle was really effective. Another really good example of this is the student who's been suspended for hitting somebody and all of a sudden starts hitting all the time. Well, gosh, all I had to do was hit somebody, and that's what I get to get sent home? Wonderful. Who do I have to hit? So we have to be careful to respond in ways that don't reinforce the challenging behavior to prevent the further escalation. This is another way of looking at it, talking about responding to behavior. It's either reinforcement or punishment. With reinforcement, you could either give them a cookie, give them a Skittle, give them a treat, give them a pat on the back, give them praise, give them points, give them whatever you want every time you see something positive happening. When something negative is happening, they might lose something. So they might lose a privilege, they might lose points, they might not get to sit with their friends. If that's a losing a natural privilege is something that works out really well here in terms of reinforcement. The example that they're giving you here is, how did we get people to use seatbelts? When I was a kid in the 70s, there was no such thing. We all just kind of rolled around in the back seats, right? Nowadays, how we get people to use seatbelts is if you don't have your seatbelt on, it starts making this obnoxious dinging noise, doesn't it? And the only way to get it to stop making that obnoxious dinging noise is to use the appropriate behavior, so to put that seatbelt on. So you remove an aversive is another good way of giving reinforcement, by taking away an aversive. So for example, you've got a student with autism who hates to sit, who can't sit still, and it's really aversive for him to have to sit still in the classroom, and you tell him you can stand or you can sit on this type of teacher's chair, and you take that aversive away for him to be able to function appropriately. The other way to look at it is in terms of punishment. And now the thing with punishment is you can give negative punishment, like a speeding ticket, like a timeout, like a card flip, like a DMV hearing. What happens when you get a speeding ticket? We're going to talk about this in a little bit, but what happens when you get a speeding ticket is typically you're going to, well, if you're like me anyway, you drive slow for the next 50 miles, keeping an eye on the sides of the road until you forget and you don't see any cops anymore, and then you start driving at the speed that you're comfortable with, because the absence of having that punishment looming over your head, in the absence of that goes away. So punishment isn't really as effective as reinforcing a positive behavior. 15 minutes for being good. If you're good for 15 minutes, you can earn computer time, so you get rewards in this case. So it's kind of more abstract than this one. Here, I see you being good. I'm gonna target that right away. Here, it's a little bit over time. If I see prolonged periods of goodness, then you might get a positive reinforcement. It's really important to understand the purpose of reinforcement and the purpose of punishment. A lot of the times I get called into schools for kids that are getting suspended on a regular basis, or timed out, or having their cards flipped, and I say to those teams, what's the function of punishment? What is your meaning of punishment? And they say, to teach the child not to have that problem behavior again. And if I say to you, how's that working for you on your 10th suspension in a row? Is this working for this student with autism? How many times a day have you had him flip a card? And is that effective? Is that an effective strategy to teach him not to do the behavior again? 99.9 times out of 100, the answer is no, that's not an effective strategy. The kid with autism keeps getting suspended, or he has massive meltdowns whenever you try to correct his or punish his behavior. So understanding, keeping in mind the function of punishment and the function of reinforcement as you're doling it out, so that you have the right system in place. A lot of times what teams and principals, administrators will say to me is, well, it's not fair to the other kids. What am I supposed to tell the other kids when he tackled this kid in the hallway? I'm just supposed to let him get away with that? My response to that is, you got to do what you have to do in terms of what your school system is. And if you have to explain to other parents that he was punished, we took care of it, Mrs. So-and-so, whatever you have to do, I understand that, and I support you, and I support your system, as long as you don't think that that's actually going to fix the problem. In fact, if you need to recognize the fact that those punishments may actually cause additional problems that you also will have to go back and fix. So if you're in your system, and the system says if he does X, he gets suspended, fine, I understand that and I support it, but understand that when he comes back, you're going to have to work him through why he got suspended, and the fact that when he comes in, he's at ground zero, he's fine, everything's going to be okay. What does being suspended mean? There's a lot more training that has to go on. And I typically will recommend using something other than a card flip system. And if you have to train the other class members that this is why so-and-so doesn't have card flips, he's working on a different system. He has, for example, a 5-point scale where he's self-managing and getting his own behavior under control. You may have to front load that a little bit to make it match or work for your other students, or consider thinking in terms of universal design and a system that would work for everybody. The purpose and the intent of reinforcement is to correct or to reinforce correct behavior. So catching him being good and catching him doing what he's supposed to be doing should be reinforced all the time. What I often say to teams is, if I go in and observe you interacting with your student, and I mark down, I just have 2 columns, positive reinforcement and correction or redirection, 90% of what your interactions are with my student with ASD are corrections and redirections. You're constantly nagging at this kid, constantly redirecting him, and rarely saying, hey, good job, you did it. Hey, I like the way you did this. Now, granted, my kids a lot of times don't give you that many opportunities, and you really have to look for them. But what we know about research with human beings is that in order for something to be shaped behaviorally, the ratio needs to be 4 positive interactions to 1 correction. 4 to 1, people. Do the checklist yourself and look at how you're interacting with this student. Much of the time, the problem is you and the fact that you are just constantly redirecting him and nowhere near enough positive reinforcement is happening. You just have to have the right tool, guys. The right cookie, the right reinforcement strategy is everything with kids with ASD. Oh, with all kids, I should say. Some more facts about punishment. The idea, I love this little cartoon here. You like this? It's the only place in the world where you can get time off for bad behavior. And we always like to say, well, you know, if the parents at home would just follow through and they could actually do punishments at home. Realistically, guys, if you can't contain this kid's behavior in the classroom and there are people on your team who are trained to work with kids with Asperger's syndrome, what are the odds that the parents know how to control and contain his behavior? What are the odds that the parents really just needs a break, has 4 other kids at home, needs to cook dinner, and this kid is so out of control that, okay, just go to your room and stim, okay, just sit on the computer and play video games? Not many of our parents are strong enough or have the time enough or have all the pieces in place to do a really appropriate intervention at home. So odds are good that when you're sending them home, either on a shortened, reduced day, a send home, or a suspension, you need to accept the fact that they are probably being somewhat reinforced by being at home, at least. And that's the best case scenario. So we may not teach them, and the thing about punishment too is that in the best case scenario, we're teaching them don't do that. Here's what not to do, but we're not teaching them what to do. Now, neurotypical kids can learn in their environment and can catch things through osmosis that kids with neurological deficiencies and social awareness problems can't do, okay? Neurotypical kids can just learn this through imitation. Kids with Asperger's syndrome and social disorders can't do that. They actually need to be taught the appropriate behaviors, and by punishing them, we don't get to that piece of it. So it's something that might work quickly in the short term, but like I talked about with the speeding ticket, as soon as that threat of punishment is gone, I don't have somebody standing over me giving me the teacher look, hands on hips, eyes on me, or the cop sitting on the side of the road, that behavior returns. And in the meantime, as I said, with card flipping and timeouts, you're likely to increase the behavioral challenges to a point where it's so disruptive and can become dangerous and nobody can learn. And also you might have negative emotional responses, such as the child is now so freaked out by the punishment itself, he may try to elope or escape or just get out of there and do something even more dangerous than what he was doing before, just to get away from the punishment. And then add this piece in. You have maybe damaged your rapport with the student, and equally important, your rapport with the parents. If you're doing a lot of send homes, a lot of suspensions, and putting this off on the parents, most of the time what I see are really ticked off parents who feel like you're putting off the burden on them. And a lot of times what I hear is, I don't have this problem with him at home. You're having it at school. Why am I expected to fix the school problem? And I gotta say I agree with that. And now you've damaged relationships and the team isn't functioning well together, the parents and the school or the school and the student. So this is a slide that I really enjoy presenting because it kind of puts things in the simplest perspective. When we talk about why is a behavior happening, it's a big thing, and you can do in fact, I'll give myself another note of something to include. You can do a full-on functional behavior assessment that you can get from Wayne County Reese's website, and I'll put that in the folder. You can do a shortened version of an FBA or an extended version of an FBA. You can collect data for a long time. You can do scatter plot data and FBA data and really get down to the fine point of why is this behavior happening. But really, it's 2 basic reasons. It's either to get something or to get out of something, to avoid something. So, ideas of things that a child might get out of this negative behavior. Relaxation. I get to do what I want to do. Self-stimulation. Kids with Asperger's and autism have different neurological makeups that make them have certain drives to do what we call self-stimulatory behavior, or stims, and a lot of times the behavior that they're doing is for that self-stimulation, just to give themselves that input. to get fairness, because it's not fair, and this needs to be fair. To get sensory input, similar to what I just described, just to get pleasure out of it. Those are internal things that things that might be going on. Externally, I'm looking to get attention. I want to do what I want to do. What's the choice? I want that thing right there. I want that toy. I want that Mario Kart. I want that book. I want that. I want that break. I want this. I want that. Things that I want. I want to get praised. I want the teacher to like me. I want preferred activities. I really am obsessed with Thomas the Train, which is pretty common with my young students, or dinosaurs, or Yu-Gi-Oh cards, or in one student's case, World War II fighter planes, whatever my obsession is, and I've got to get to that thing that I'm obsessed with right now. I need to get one of these things. Whoops, we'll go back. Sorry, didn't mean to click. And the other thing that they're doing is trying to avoid something. They want to avoid failure. I have one student right now who's just miserable all the time because all that happens is, he can't do the work. He can't interact with peers. He can't perform, and he's so frustrated all the time that he told me, he's a verbal kid, he says the only thing that helps with this is when I go to sleep. So he puts his head down on the desk and he just sleeps, because otherwise he's just going to screw up, and he knows it. Another thing that kids are trying to avoid, and this you can relate to too, this is all true for adults too, is embarrassment. I don't want to be embarrassed, so I'm not going to perform in class so you can see how stupid I look. I want to avoid boredom. I mean, let's be realistic. School is, I know you guys are all great teachers and everything, but school is boring for most students, even neurotypical students, and I can't stand the boredom. And if I'm a person with social dysregulation, I don't know how to hide the fact that I'm bored like the other kids in 3rd grade do. How to avoid anxiety. This is going to freak me out. I'm so uncomfortable. I don't know when that fire drill is going to happen. I don't know if I'm going to have to see that bully on the playground. I don't know if I am going to have to see a bug on the floor. I don't know if she's going to make me do work, and this is making me very anxious. I need to avoid this anxiety. External things that kids are trying to avoid, realistically, a lot of the time, they're trying to avoid the work that you're trying to make them do, because why should they have to do it? They're trying to avoid sensory input that's offensive. You know that kids with Asperger's and autism have very different sensory systems, where even a quiet fan in the background that you wouldn't even hear might be painful and aversive to a student with ASD. Overhead lights that flicker could cause migraines. The stimulation of all the different input of everything in the environment can be very overwhelming. So these may be things, when you see kids with autism, sometimes they put their hands over their ears, or they'll put their head down on their shoulder to cover their ears. A lot of times it's because they're trying to avoid sensory input. They may be trying to avoid their peers, because peers are unpredictable and they don't know what they're going to do, or avoid their teacher. They don't want to interact with other people at all, or they're trying to avoid what that teacher's going to tell them, so you might see some acting out behaviors there. They may be trying to avoid homework or chores. So they're either trying to get something or get out of something. It's that simple. What you need to figure out is which, and how can you prevent it. One way to do that is to determine would it happen if he was allowed to do whatever he wants. So a lot of times I'll ask, does this behavior happen at home? Does it happen during free time? Does it happen during recess? Does it happen in an empty classroom? If you took all the variables away, would it still happen? Then that would tell you that, is it demand-based? Is it based on this? Is it based on that? If the child is given non-contingent access to do what he wants to do, or to the thing that he wants, does the behavior stop? So more about FBA. Let's see. Oops. Looking at the antecedents and the consequences. Where does the behavior happen? What time of day does the behavior happen? Who was he with? And I have one student in particular who really likes to pick on one particular peer. We haven't figured out why he doesn't like this kid, or what, other than the kid is older than he is, and he seems to be offended by the fact that the kid is somewhat older than he is and is telling him what to do. And it only happens with this child, so we can really address the fact that it only happens with this child. What are the demands or expectations? Does he really do it during writing? By the way, most students with Asperger's syndrome and autism have issues with writing, either with the actual fine motor piece of it or with the language piece. Organizing their thoughts into paragraphs and into cohesive papers is incredibly stressful for a lot of my students. Is there something in the environment that is making him uncomfortable? Is there something in the curriculum himself? I've got one student in kindergarten at one of my elementary schools who hates with a passion animals. And of course the teacher uses zoophonics, so it's a tantrum every day. So this child, in that case we just had to use something other than zoophonics with this student, or make sure he wasn't around when those animals were in place. And then we taught him some new skills in terms of tolerating animals in the workplace. And is this structured versus unstructured time? Does it happen more at recess and lunch and during hallway breaks, or does it happen during the classroom time? Is there something that we need to tweak? If it's recess, maybe we need to structure his recess time. A lot of times we've done that. What level of support is happening? Is he better when he has extra adult support? Is he better in a small group or versus a large group? Is he better one-on-one? What does it look like when he has a daily schedule, when he has his own personal visual schedule? Does he have more of a problem during transitions, like transitioning from activity to activity? Does he have trouble because he's moving on to language arts, but he's not done with math, and he's really angry because he's not done with math yet, and you're trying to get him to go to language arts? Does he have trouble with transitions from a favored activity, such as computer time or free read time, and being transitioned into a working activity? Which is one of those things the problem, and what supports can we put in place? Does he have problems with certain adults and certain adult attitudes? I can pick out certain adults that are going to be triggers to my students with Asperger's syndrome because they don't realize what they sound like. And it's this teacher tone that is really characteristic. Every building I go to, there's at least one person who speaks like this. Hey, Jimmy, where are you supposed to be right now? What's the expectation? And that happens especially at the upper and middle schools. When you hear that tone, a person with autism, that really can trigger their anxiety and a fear factor, and then you get the fight or flight, and you get some acting out behaviors. What are the sensory issues that are happening with this student, and what impacts him, and what other issues might be causal with this problem? One of the ways to look at this is to try and figure out what those causes are, is to take data. I know you all love to take data. I'm going to include a data sheet in this folder as well, a couple of different forms of data sheets, but realistically, your data collection system can be whatever makes sense to you so that the boxes get filled in or the data actually gets collected. If the data system is too overwhelming, in my experience, it doesn't get collected. So one way to do it is what they've done here, which is not to look at necessarily times, but to look at activities. So if it happened during the opening activity, did it happen during language arts? Sometimes we'll look at, did it happen between 8 o'clock and 8:30, and you might have this be blank. Did it happen between 8:30 and 9:15, and this might be blank. But I think you get more information if you look at what was the activity, the day of the week that it happened, and then you start to look at, this is a typo here, then you start to look at what are some patterns. And note, by the way, when they checked this, they didn't leave these boxes blank. They said the behavior did not occur. I sometimes will put smiley faces here. And here's the target behavior. In this with this student, Jason, when asked to work, he refuses to work and begins to repeat concerns about his ability to do the work correctly. Are you going to help me? I don't know how to do it. What if I do it wrong? So does it happen during the opening activity? Looks like most days it does, except for Mondays for some reason. Does it happen during language arts? Not quite as much. Does it happen during gym? Doesn't happen at all during gym. Does it happen during snack? Doesn't happen at all during snack. Does it happen during cleanup or free time? Not usually. Does it happen during math? Not as much. When are we seeing the majority of this behavior? Well, looks like it's happening the most when we're asking him to work independently. Sorry, we'll go back. When we're asking him to work on his own. In these other adult-led instructional periods, it seems to happen less. So what could we do about that? During science and social studies, it's happening an awful lot. What's happening in science that would cause that behavior to happen? We start to think about what can we do in those environments to make that happen. Same form. So again, looking at this same student, during language arts, your antecedent or your A behavior was when he's asked to do independent work. This is what Jason does. Initially, he sits and does absolutely nothing, and then he begins to perseverate over why it won't be right. What the teacher does is she comes over and she starts talking with him and she reasons with him, and eventually he starts working. In science class, it happens when the class is working again on independent assignments. The teacher is busy with a peer. This, by the way, is what we call an ABC chart. I'm going to include this in your documents as well, in your handouts for this. The class is working on independent assignments and the teacher's busy with somebody else. Jason again mumbles, "I can't do this, it's all wrong." What does the teacher do? She sees that he's not working and she tells him to get started. She stands next to him, telling him it's not wrong up until he begins. This typically takes less than 5 minutes. In special ed class, like the resource room, if he's given multiple worksheets, Jason sits quietly at the desk looking around the room and eventually begins to perseverate over his ability to do the work correctly. Here, he begins work shortly after the teacher sits at the table with him. You're starting to see the pattern here? What's happening here? During math, when given independent work, again, Jason goes directly to support for assistance. Jason immediately gets to work. When given work, let's go back here. When given independent work, the teacher immediately goes to Jason for support and assistance. So that's why it's not happening in math very often, is the teacher starts off next to him. And Jason immediately gets to work on his math assignment. The teacher monitors the class periodically every 8 to 10 minutes, checks on Jason to see if he needs help. Well, isn't that interesting? So what does that tell us about Jason's function? Well, what it looks like is that Jason has an anxiety issue and he's trying to avoid embarrassment over being wrong. And what works is having an adult with him, but that's not always realistic. This adult seems to have figured it out. If she starts with him right off, gets him rolling, and then goes back and checks on him every 8 to 10 minutes, the child seems to be working on his own. Otherwise, he sits and perseverates all day. That's one way to fix it. Another way is to say to him, "Hey, Jason, I know that you're going to need help with this. I need to finish teaching the class, and then I'll sit with you in just 5 minutes. Can you work on part of what you think you can do on your own, and then I'll be with you in just a few minutes." That will avoid all of the negative verbalization that can be very disruptive in the classroom and the increase of anxiety. So keeping in mind, what is the function of the behavior? The function is to either get something or to avoid something. Well, when it is that, what we can do is, if it's to get something, we can embed it in the schedule, or we can let him know when are we done doing something that he wants to avoid. We teach him a new skill. Where can I get this? When can I get this? And how can I get this? Teach him to understand that. Teach him to understand how that works in the schedule. And then we can reinforce it. The adult response to this is actually give him what he needs. Flood him with the thing that he needs. Give him access to the thing that he needs during appropriate times in the schedule, or during times like reinforcement for when he's being good. If it's a skill deficit, something he doesn't know how to do, or a performance deficit, you got to teach him how to do it. Or give him some strategies that he can do it independently. Make accommodations to the lesson. Reduce the workload. Add check boxes. Add fill in the blanks. Put things in multiple choice format. Outline boxes. Make it doable for him to reduce his anxiety. Sometimes it's just the ASD that is the function of the behavior, and by that I mean he's really rigid and he has a lot of anxiety, or he has some obsessions or some compulsions that cause problems, where he might have a lack of generalization about things, or maybe he's overgeneralizing certain ideas. And when that's the case, we have to specifically address those issues in the schedule. One of the big mistakes that I have with teams, and this is where I tend to go to a process called meeting mechanics so that we kind of get away from this because it's not productive, is this negative assumptions that people have. They have all these assumptions about behavior that may or may not be true, frankly, but they're not things that are productive. They're not things that we can fix. By saying he's manipulative, and I hear this one at least once a day. He's being defiant, or he's non-compliant. He's just stubborn. He knows how to do it. He's just lazy. He just wants to argue with me. He has sensory issues. He's being disrespectful. He's just trying to get attention. He's his own worst enemy. He's not motivated. He's uncooperative. He's selfish. You know what? Not going to argue with you about any of those things. They may all be true, but what does this do? When you say he's manipulative, he's defiant, he's stubborn, he's lazy, he's argumentative, when you say those things, it absolves you of the responsibility to help. It absolves you, it absolves the adult, it absolves the teaching unit of the public schools of being able to do anything. So you might as well just throw up your hands because he's manipulative. What are you going to do? Instead of thinking in terms of why is he manipulative? What does he get, or what is he trying to avoid by being manipulative, and how can we fix that? We spend too much time just making these statements. He could do it if he wants to. Yes, he probably could do it if he wanted to. How can we work on motivating him? So I talked a little bit about meeting mechanics. Meeting mechanics is a process on which I actually have a whole training on this. That's from START, the START training. And it talks about these steps to solving a problem. You first start by specifically identifying what the problem is in an objectifiable way, in a measurable way. If you say he's non-compliant, what do you mean specifically? Well, when I ask him to do something, he doesn't do it. Oh, so you ask him to eat an ice cream bar, he wouldn't eat that ice cream bar? No. When you ask him to do math, during math class, he doesn't do it. When I ask him to turn the page, what specifically do you mean by the problem? What do you mean by non-compliance? Get the specifics. When does it happen? Why does it happen? Does it happen in every environment? Think back to that slide I showed you with Jason. It wasn't happening in math class, was it? This whining about not knowing or being concerned that his answers were going to be wrong. It was happening during language arts, and it was happening during the opening session, but it didn't happen during math class. Why didn't it happen? Then the team gets together and starts to brainstorm, what are some solutions that we could put in place? What are some ideas? Well, what if we started the math lesson, or what if we started the class lesson with the adult giving individual instruction and then checking back on him every 8 minutes? What if we gave him a visual on his desk that said, raise your hand if you need help? What if we wrote a social story about what to do when to ask for help? What if we trained him a new skill of reaching out to his peers to ask for help? What if we trained the peers? And you go through this whole series of brainstorming, what are different ideas that might help with this problem behavior? Then you sort of start to cluster and prioritize which of these ideas seem like the most effective strategies, things that we think need to be done first, that will work together well in the environment that you're in, and what's the idea that we're going to go with there. Here, then, we talk about why would that be difficult? Well, geez, we can't train the peers because this kid's parents don't know that won't let him know that he has autism. That one comes up a lot. Or we can't train the peers because we can't use them like parapros. Well, we can get permission slips from all of those kids' parents. Well, instead of calling it autism, we could talk about people with social learning differences. Or, in one case, one way we problem solved that whole the kid doesn't know they have autism thing is we trained the whole class how to support each other when they were having difficulty. That was in one of my Leader in Me buildings. So that there are a lot of ways, if you come up with the best idea on the table here after brainstorming, and there are problems like, well, who's going to do that? We don't have enough hands. This is where the team will get together and problem solve how you're going to do that, because you are going to do that because you decided it was the best idea on the table. And you're going to assign responsibilities to whoever's at the table. You're going to say, okay, principal, you're in charge of designing the permission slips to send home to the parents to train the peers. And speech pathologist, you're going to come up with a lesson for how to instruct the peers to interact with the other kids. And social worker, you can help her out on that. Classroom teacher, you're responsible for prompting the students to follow through with this assignment. And resource room teacher, you're going to create the visual that goes along with this assignment. We're going to check back with you in 7 days. When we come back to the table, everybody's going to report on their assignments. If we get back to the table and somebody has dropped the ball and hasn't done that, we're going to hold them accountable and say, oh, you didn't get it done? Did you need help? When can you have it done? Can I check back with you at the end of the day? So that things actually are moving forward instead of spending a lot of time talking about the problem. He's manipulative. He just wants attention. You could spend 2 hours talking about this, or you can flow through this series of ideas, get to a point where people have a job, and break in 45 minutes with a plan. Okay, we have a few more slides in this section, and as we move forward into the next sections, we're going to be focusing more specifically on school-wide positive behavioral supports. And if you know anything about PBS and RTI and everything else, you know that everything is kind of drawn into this sort of pyramid strategies. So let me just address the multi-tiered systems of support, MTSS, for students with ASD. The multi-tiers are these. For students with ASD, it starts with whatever your core curriculum is and whatever your instructional strategies are for the classroom, just your general strategies that everybody's using. And as these things don't seem to be enough, we might go up the next step and look at the universal supports for students with ASD. Looking at universal supports is that assessment tool that I showed you earlier, and that also is in your handouts. It's called the USAPT, Universal Supports for Autism Programming and Planning Tool. And which of those supports is falling apart for this student? Let's do that assessment and make sure everything's in place that works for kids with ASD. So here's what works for everybody. Then we're going to make sure that everything that works for kids with ASD is in place. then even though we have all of this in place, are pretty comfortable about what's in place there, this specific student needs some specific targeted interventions that are just for him. And sometimes we need to get very intensive about that level of instruction, and sometimes things have to have very targeted instruction for very specific skills that we need to teach a student. When we talk about that, we're oftentimes talking about one of the evidence-based practices that I pointed out to you on those websites, antecedent-based interventions. Okay, antecedent-based interventions, you remember I told you, are things that we can do on the front end to be proactive to prevent problem behavior in kids with autism. They're a collection of these strategies. One of these such things is you take their ideas of fixation. Kids with ASD often have sort of these fixations or obsessions, if you will, on certain ideas or concepts. I have one student who's really into elevators. Oftentimes students are into vacuum cleaners. Sometimes students are into bugs. Sometimes they're into research. Sometimes they're into making lists. It could be anything, but that's all they want to do. Superheroes are another really big fixation. Disney tends to be a big one with my girls a lot of times. Well, girls are rare, but a lot of times it's Disney princesses. So we can take the idea of the thing that they really, really are driven for, that they're really into, that they really want to do, and we show them on the schedule when they can do it. Well, we got language arts, then Disney time. We got math and reading, then here's your Disney icon. You can have a Disney break. Or we can have our icons be Disney schedules. We can use it in the curriculum. Can we work Disney princesses into the language arts? Can we read about Disney princesses? Can we write about Disney princesses? Can we do math, counting how many Disney princesses? Can we put this into these what are the math stories called? Those language stories for math, whatever. How can we embed that kid's fixation into the curriculum? Or can we give it to them as reinforcement for being good? How can we use, I like to call this using their autism against them, build those fixations into the routine, and that's an antecedent-based intervention. It's a preventative strategy. Another thing that we have control over, excuse me, is the schedule and how we're presenting that. Most of the time when I go in and say, hey, does he have a schedule? The teacher will say, it's on the wall for all the kids. Well, kids with autism need something a little bit more specific. Sometimes they need a different schedule than the other kids are having. They always need a visual schedule, either written. It doesn't have to be those little picture icons, by the way. If the kid reads, give him a written schedule that he can use a little pencil and check things off. And then mini schedules. So don't just have it say language arts. Have it say language arts, but then on his desk have a little 1, 2, 3 step expectation of do this, then do this, then do this. Mini schedules are a very powerful tool with kids with autism. Just write down the 3 quick things that he needs to do. Do 1, do 2, do 3, then here's your reinforcement. You can decide whether the activity needs to be adult-directed or student-directed. And if it's student-directed and he can't be independent, what can you do to the work to make it something that he can complete independently? What can you do to the work to make it very clear and very obvious? Like, can you highlight the answer box? Can you give it a yes, no, circle 1 situation? Can you fill in a blank? Can you alter the work in such a way that the student can do it independently? Or is it something that he's going to need adult support with? You can alter the schedule. Oh, I'm sorry, another piece, this is about altering the schedule and routine, is it might have something that's adult-directed versus the student-directed time. This is where he's working independently, then he has adult help. Independent, adult help. Here, if he has to do something that he doesn't like doing, a lot of times it's really good to change the schedule so that he has it in between 2 preferred activities. So he's coming in from recess, and then he has math, but as soon as he's done with math, he gets to go to computer time. So kind of sandwiching that in between 2 preferred activities will help you get the momentum for that. That's another antecedent-based intervention. Another antecedent-based intervention is the idea of transitions. Kids with ASD often have difficulty transitioning in between items that they're trying to complete, and if they're not finished, they get a lot of anxiety and they don't want to move on, or they don't want to leave a preferred activity to move to a non-preferred activity, or they don't want to move from activity to activity because they're unsure about what's going to happen next. There are a variety of reasons that kids with ASD have difficulty with transitions, and some typical transition interventions that you can have in place just to sort of prevent that is to warn the student is one thing, is to say, Frankie, we're going to be all done with quiet reading time in 3 minutes. Frankie, 2 minutes. Frankie, 1 minute. And okay, students' quiet reading time is all done. You could even give him a visual that lets him know that quiet reading is about to stop, or this preferred activity is about to change. But letting him know ahead of time will prevent that meltdown that happens if you stand up in front of the class and say, okay, quiet reading's all done, it's time to go to math, and your kid with Asperger's syndrome or high-functioning autism was really, really enjoying that quiet time and isn't ready to move on. Another thing that sometimes is helpful are visual timers. And by the way, pretty much you can get an app for a time timer for free on your phone, on your computer. There are a variety of things. Please don't spend money on these unless you absolutely have to, but these visual timers do exist. And just kind of showing the kid that when the red is all done, or when the timer goes off, that's when you're done with this fun break time thing that you had. Or, hey, you know what? If you can get your math done by the time this red timer is done, then you can earn this reward. That's a very powerful tool that helps motivate kids too. So I know that if I hurry up and get this done, and I'm done before this happens, then I get my reward. So either letting them know when the preferred activity ends, or letting them know if they get done in an X amount of time, they might get a preferred activity, are two really functional ways that you can utilize a timer. And utilizing routines, helping them understand on the front end, front loading with, hey, this is what your day is going to look like. First, we're going to have language arts. These are the 3 things you're going to do in language arts. Next, we're going to have math. Okay, we're moving into math now, David. These are the 3 things you're going to do in math today. And having the routines be predictable. And if they're not predictable, have them spelled out graphically or visually so the student knows what to expect. And a final list of antecedent-based interventions for students with ASD, that is things that will prevent acting out behavior for students with ASD, where you have a collection of strategies here that involve choices. So do you want to write with a crayon or a pencil? Do you want to write with a pen or a pencil? Do you want to write on the slant board or on the flat board? Do you want to write at the teacher table or at your desk? Which group do you want to sit with? The choices that you can give him that are structured choices where he still has to do the work but he has some control really help with students when they have control issues. And a lot of my students with ASD do have control issues. Differentiated instruction, which is sort of like ABA, where you're asking them to do something and then they have the interaction and the engagement happening, or you can change the output. Things that you can do for differentiated instruction are to change the input. A lot of times teachers just get up from in front of the class and lecture, but if you can have visual presentation, if you have the luxury of having technology to use video, to use even overhead presentation, or giving the student manipulatives, how you're presenting the information, changing that input can really help engage a student with autism. If the student can interact with what's going on and you have them hooked, you have active engagement, this student can function better and can really pay attention. So really playing around with the way you're delivering the instruction and the way you're engaging the students actively. Then also making accommodations for output. If a student with Asperger's syndrome or high-functioning autism, or any student, has difficulty with writing nowadays, we don't even consider that a learning disability. Consider letting him use technology. Consider letting him dictate to somebody else and having them take the notes for you. Consider having him do a fill-in-the-blank versus a short essay to demonstrate his knowledge. All of those are legal accommodations that you're allowed to make, and by putting those things in place, you alleviate the anxiety for the student and therefore reduce the problem behavior. And finally, allow access to sensory stimuli based on the function behavior assessment if you determine that the student is either craving certain sensory inputs or avoiding certain sensory input. I often will recommend that you work with an OT about that, or an autism consultant who understands sensory strategies, and provide access to the recommended sensory stimuli, or provide the ability to avoid certain sensory stimuli. So, you'll see a lot of students with autism wearing sound deadening headphones sometimes because certain noises are really invasive, and that's one way that you can go about that. So that was part 1 of our behavior training for students with autism. In parts 2 and 3, we're going to get more specific into positive behavior supports for students with autism, and also problem behavior and crisis behavior. So look for those in the envelope for things to come.